Could you survive with no power, no stores, and no second chances? Early American pioneers did it daily, armed with just 10 tools. Not all were weapons. Some could feed a family for months. Others lit fires in snowstorms. These weren't conveniences, they were lifelines. Think you'd guessed them all? Stick around, because by the end of this video, you'll know the real tools that built America and which ones could save you if everything fell apart today. Pemmican. The very first thing we would have to talk about is pemmican. In the early frontier towns like Fort Benton or Dodge City, settlers had a big problem, and that problem was how to store food. You see, the people of the West were excellent hunters and farmers. They had the skills to raise crops, trap wild game, and bring down a deer before breakfast. So catching meat wasn't the issue. The main issue was keeping it from going bad. Refrigeration did not exist. Salt was expensive. Winters were harsh, and summers could make fresh meat rot in a matter of hours. In addition to that, getting this meat wasn't a daily guarantee. You might get lucky one week and then find nothing the next. This situation forced people to get smart, and that's where pemmican came in. Borrowed from the indigenous peoples of the plains, especially the Cree and Métis, pemmican was a simple but brilliant solution. Hunters would dry strips of meat over low heat until they were brittle. Then they would pound it into a fine powder and mix it with melted fat, sometimes tossing in dried berries for taste and nutrition. The result of this process was a dense, high-energy food that could last for months, even years, without spoiling. So, with no fridge, no salt, no canning. They were able to eat it cold, melt it into soup, or fry it in a pan. It was survival food in its purest form, light, long-lasting, and loaded with calories. Pemmican became a staple not just for trappers and traders, but for entire families. It was packed for long journeys, stashed away for winter, and relied on, in lean times when the hunt came up short. It wasn't fancy, but it worked, and in the frontier, what worked was all that mattered. Now, if you've enjoyed the story so far, make sure to hit that subscribe button and turn on notifications, because what's coming next is something you definitely don't want to miss. Paracord, or frontier rope. The next thing we would have to talk about right after the pemmican is the use of cordage, and in modern terms, that means paracord. On the frontier, rope wasn't just useful, it was everywhere, all the time, in ways most people today wouldn't even think about. Back in the early homesteads and rough camps scattered across places like the Nebraska Territory or Montana's Bitterroot Valley. Because of the nature of their environment, every chore, every fix, every structure needed some kind of fastening, binding, or lifting. To make it worse, nails were rare, and for screws it was even more scarce. But as for rope, it was everywhere, and that made it turn to gold. From these ropes, families made their own from twisted plant fibers, rawhide, or horsehair. And they even used it for everything, whether it was tying down loads in wagons, bundling firewood, hanging meat, stretching hides, building shelters, and even fashioning snares for trapping small game. The best part here was that if it broke, they did not throw it. All they had to do was to retire it. Rope was never wasted. Today, we know paracord as that lightweight, ultra-strong cord favored by soldiers and survivalists, and it's easy to see why. If pioneers had access to modern paracord, they likely would have traded almost anything for it. Stronger than leather, more flexible than sinew, and easy to carry, it would have been the dream tool of their time. One of the most overlooked but essential uses of rope on the frontier was problem solving. If a wagon axle broke, you were often out of luck. But if your cord tore, you could fix it with a knot or a quick stitch. If a child's boot fell apart in the middle of winter, you could wrap it tight with rope and keep moving. In emergencies, rope was not just useful, it could save lives. When people think of survival, they usually picture knives or guns. But ask any experienced outdoorsman, and they'll tell you, without rope, you're stuck. And on the frontier, being stuck could quickly turn into something dangerous, so whether it was hemp, animal hide, or what we now call paracord, rope was always close at hand, always needed, and absolutely essential. So now we talked about how they got their food preserved, but when it came to eating, it was a different ball game. And out on the frontier, there was no kitchen, fire, and one heavy black pot that could do it all. So how did they survive with that pot? Let's find out. Cast iron Dutch oven. Another essential survival tool on the frontier was the cast iron Dutch oven. To understand just how important it was, forget about modern kitchens and stovetops, because out there, this heavy black pot was the kitchen. It could bake, boil, roast, and fry. It sat directly in campfire coals, hung from a hook over open flames, or was buried in the ground to act like a makeshift oven. In towns like Independence, Missouri, or outposts on the Oregon Trail, nearly every wagon carried one. Why? Because a good Dutch oven could do everything. In the morning, it simmered coffee or porridge. By midday, it was cooking beans or stew. Come evening, it was baking cornbread or apple cobbler if you were lucky enough to have flour and fruit. And unlike tin pots or copper pans, cast iron lasted. It did not warp, it did not dent. It got better with use, developing a seasoned coating that made food less likely to stick and actually tasted better over time. But there was more to it than durability. The Dutch oven was efficient. It held heat, cooked evenly, and could turn the roughest ingredients into something warm and filling. And when meals were scarce, even that little bit of comfort mattered. Families passed them down, and in some cases, they were among the few items saved when wagons had to be lightened. That's how essential they were. They were not easy to carry, sure, they were heavy, but no one minded. Because when you were hundreds of miles from the nearest town and the wind was howling outside your cabin or tent, there was nothing more valuable than a pot that could turn scraps into a hot meal. And this is where it gets more interesting. Stay tuned. Heirloom seeds. After food and fire, the next thing the people of the West used to need to survive and thrive on was something much smaller, and that was seeds. The use of heirloom seeds can be traced back to places like the Kansas prairies or Montana homesteads, where grocery stores didn't exist. So what they ate depended almost entirely on what they could grow, and for that, they needed heirloom seeds. Not store-bought, not sterile, but seeds passed down from family to family, season to season. These seeds were living legacies. Carefully dried, saved, and stored in sacks, pouches, or even old tins, they held the promise of tomorrow. Beans, corn, squash, cabbage, carrots, every garden variety had a story and a purpose. Some were drought-resistant. Others matured fast for short-growing seasons. Many were chosen for flavor, others simply because they grew. Pioneers did not have the luxury of trial and error. A failed crop didn't mean disappointment, it simply meant hunger. That's why heirloom seeds were so valuable. They could trust them. They also knew how they grew, how they tasted, and how to tend them. Many families brought them across oceans or carried them westward wrapped in cloth, tucked into hope chests, or sewn into clothing. Seed saving became a form of quiet, powerful knowledge. Parents taught their children how to select the healthiest plants, collect their seeds, dry them, and protect them for the next year. These weren't just garden supplies. They were lifelines. Flint and steel. One essential thing people in the Old West relied on for survival was fire. But the real challenge wasn't using it, it was starting it. Matches weren't available yet, and lighters didn't exist, so they had to improvise. Before matches became common and long before lighters, there was only one way to make fire: flint and steel. And out in the wilderness, fire wasn't just comfort, it was life. Pioneer families traveling west, whether through the Cumberland Gap or across the Rockies, carried small fire-starting kits everywhere they went. Inside a leather pouch or tin box, you would find a sharp piece of flint, a steel striker, and some kind of tinder, maybe char cloth, dry moss, or crumbled birch bark. The technique was simple in theory, but it took skill, and that was for one to strike the steel against the flint, catch a spark on the tinder, blow gently, and coax it into flame. No spark, no fire, no fire, no food, no warmth, no safety. A fire meant hot meals, clean water, light in the darkness, and protection from wild animals. It dried your clothes, hardened your tools, and kept frostbite away in brutal winters. Every morning started with it. Every night ended beside it. What made flint and steel so essential wasn't just that they worked, it was that they kept working. Matches could get wet. Striking stones didn't wear out. You could use them in the rain, out on the plains, or in a snowstorm, as long as you had dry tinder and a bit of patience. Even children learned how to use them early on. In many families, lighting the fire became a rite of passage, a sign that you were ready to take part in keeping the home alive. To us, it might seem primitive. But in its time, this little kit was the heart of the household. Without it, everything stopped. And once you got it going, you guarded it. Fires were banked overnight with ash to keep embers alive, because starting from scratch again in a storm, that could mean the difference between comfort and catastrophe. But it did not stop there. Spinning wheel. The spinning wheel was another key survival tool used by pioneer families. To the people of the West, a spinning wheel was just as important as an axe or a rifle. But why was that so? Because survival wasn't only about food, it was also about warmth. Clothes, blankets, socks, mittens, everything had to be made by hand. If the people of the West did not have wool or thread, they couldn't make much of anything. And without warm layers, a frontier winter could be deadly. The spinning wheel turned raw wool or flax into usable thread or yarn. That thread could then be knitted into garments, woven into cloth, or stitched into bedding. Without this process, families were left with little more than animal hides, heavy, rough, and hard to manage. In homesteads from the Appalachian foothills to the Dakota plains, spinning was a daily ritual. Mothers taught daughters, neighbors helped neighbors. In fact, spinning was often done in groups. Spinning bees, where women gathered to work, talk, and share news. It was both practical and social, a reminder that survival often came down to shared labor and community. A good spinning wheel was usually handed down, protected during moves, and kept in working shape. Some were built by hand, others ordered from the East. Either way, once you had one, you could clothe your family without relying on expensive store-bought fabric or rare supply wagons. Even beyond its everyday use, the spinning wheel represented something bigger: self-reliance. With it, a family could take raw materials straight from their animals or fields and turn it into something useful. Every turn of the wheel was a step toward independence. On the frontier, that kind of control over your own survival wasn't just nice to have, it was absolutely necessary. The next tool will surprise you. Stay tuned. Herbal medicine kit. Now, it might surprise you to learn that the spinning wheel would not have been nearly as useful without another essential tool, the herbal medicine kit. Out on the American frontier, families often lived miles from the nearest town and days from the closest doctor. So their best chance of staying healthy did not come from a bottle. It came from the woods, the fields, and the garden. That's why every pioneer family kept an herbal medicine kit, not just as a backup, but as their first line of defense. These kits weren't fancy. Most at times, they were just a small wooden box or leather pouch filled with dried plants, roots, and hand-labeled jars. But what they represented was a family's hard-earned knowledge of the land that had been passed down through generations, shared among neighbors, and often learned the hard way. Pioneer women were usually the keepers of this knowledge. They knew which plants reduced fevers, like willow bark, what could clean a wound, yarrow or goldenrod, and how to calm a sick child's stomach, chamomile or peppermint. Some learned from old European traditions. Others learned directly from Native American women who knew the land far better than most settlers ever would. There was no Tylenol, no antibiotics, no urgent care, so families relied on what they could grow, gather, or trade. Calendula for skin infections, comfrey for broken bones, garlic for illness. Even the weeds growing near the barn could be life-saving if you knew how to use them, and the knowledge mattered just as much as the herbs themselves. Knowing how to prepare a poultice, steep a proper tea, or safely dose a tincture often meant the difference between healing and harm. Of course, it wasn't perfect. Many illnesses could not be cured, and some folk remedies were based more on hope than science. But when a child had a fever or a man cut his hand during the harvest, this kit was the only medicine they had, and more often than not, it worked. Because in a world without clinics or pharmacies, the herbal medicine kit wasn't just a collection of plants. It was a lifeline, a testament to survival, and a sign of just how much pioneers had to rely on themselves. Water bucket. And then there was the water bucket. It might sound simple, and it was, but without a good water bucket, nothing on the frontier worked. Not the cooking, not the cleaning, not the animals, not the garden. Nothing. In the early American West, running water was a rare luxury. Most families relied on nearby creeks, springs, or hand-dug wells. And every single drop for drinking, cooking, washing, watering animals, scrubbing clothes, or keeping a fire going had to be carried. That meant a bucket was needed, whether it was 1, 2, or even 10. But here's the tricky part. Not just any bucket would do. Every water bucket had to be tough, usually made of wood, reinforced with iron bands, and often handmade. Some were metal, others carved from hollowed-out tree trunks, but they all had one job: get the water home. Families hauled dozens of gallons a day, often walking long distances, just to keep the household running. Cooking, cleaning, watering animals, washing clothes, it all depended on that daily water run. Water buckets were used first thing in the morning, last thing at night. In the winter, they broke through ice. In the summer, they dried out and cracked. Maintaining your bucket meant keeping the staves tight and the handle strong. That aspect was nearly as important as maintaining your roof. Sometimes water had to be boiled to make it safe. That meant lugging it to the fire, pouring it into the Dutch oven, and waiting. Other times it had to be stored in barrels for dry spells. When disease spread through contaminated water sources, families with clean buckets and good storage habits had better odds of staying healthy. And for kids on the homestead, carrying the bucket was one of their earliest chores. It taught responsibility and muscle. Today, when we think about survival, we often imagine big, dramatic tools, knives, rifles, axes. But the humble bucket may have been the most used and most essential of all. It didn't kill game or bake bread, but it made both possible. Out on the frontier, if your bucket broke and your well ran dry, life got dangerous fast. Water was life, and the bucket was how you got it. And here comes the most shocking item of all. Keep watching because you don't want to miss out on this one. Bible or Almanac. If the Dutch oven was the physical heart of the frontier home, the Bible or Almanac was the emotional and intellectual one. Almost every pioneer family carried at least one of them, and some families usually carried both. Why was it so important? Let's start with the Bible. For many families, it was more than scripture, it was their only book. Inside its pages were not just verses, but family records, births, marriages, and deaths scrawled in pencil between chapters. It was read aloud on Sundays, used for homeschooling, and clutched during long winters and moments of grief. The Bible gave people something to hold on to when life felt like too much, when crops failed, children fell ill, or death came before its time. Even for those who didn't consider themselves especially religious, it offered comfort, structure, and a sense of continuity with the lives they'd left behind. Then there was the Almanac, which was less spiritual, but just as crucial. These little books were packed with practical information: planting schedules, moon phases, weather predictions, household tips, recipes, and even moral advice. A good almanac was like having a distant uncle who knew a little bit about everything. Families used them to know when to sow seeds, when to expect frost, when to cut hay, or start preserving food. In a time without Google or even a reliable newspaper, the almanac helped make sense of the seasons and the land. Sometimes the two books were combined, a Bible wrapped in pages from an almanac, or vice versa. In either case, these weren't just tools for survival, they were tools for understanding survival, for making it feel like part of something larger. And when the day's work was done, the fire crackled low, and the house finally quieted down, someone might open that worn, familiar book and start reading, not just for guidance, but for connection, for comfort, and to remember that even in the wildest places, they were not alone. Knife. And here comes the deal breaker. In fact, if you could only take one tool into the wilderness, it would be this: a knife. Not some oversized hunting blade or a fancy folding gadget, just a solid, sharp, reliable knife. Because on the frontier, a knife was everything. We often think of knives as weapons, and yes, they were sometimes used that way. Whether it was fending off a wild animal, signaling you weren't defenseless, or standing your ground in a tense situation, a knife could give you a critical edge when it mattered most. But most of the time, it wasn't about protection. It was about utility, and it never left your side. The people of the West used the knife to clean fish, butcher meat, cut rope, shape wooden tools, and strip bark for fire starting. It sliced food, sharpened steaks, and shaved kindling. In emergencies, it trimmed bandages, dug splinters, or cut cloth strips to stop bleeding. They used it to make dishes from bark or soft wood, cut wild leaves to use as plates or wrappers, and even fashion spoons or traps from branches. Out on the plains, a good knife made the early men resourceful. They could easily craft what they didn't have. It helped them to adapt. And when things went wrong, and they often did, it was the knife that helped the early men put things right again. Kids learned early to respect it. Adults rarely went anywhere without it. It was tied to belts, tucked into boots, or worn in homemade sheaths. It wasn't decorative, it was personal. The edge was kept sharp, the handle clean, the blade oiled. If it broke, you felt its loss deep. And when tools were passed down, the knife almost always carried a story, where it came from, what it had done, what it had helped survive. In short, a knife wasn't just for cutting, it was for making, repairing, protecting, and living. It was the silent partner in every day of frontier life, reliable, essential, and always close at hand. When you look at the tools pioneer families used to survive the American frontier, you don't just see iron and wood, you see determination. These were people on a path that couldn't be shaken, not by blizzards, not by droughts, not even by the emptiness of the wild. Because out there, survival wasn't about having everything. It was about making something out of nothing. So, which of these tools surprised you the most? Could you have lived off pemmican and fire, carried water by hand, or kept warm with nothing but wool you spun yourself? Let us know in the comments. We want to hear your take. And don't forget to like, share, and subscribe for more real, untamed stories from the American frontier. Then hit the next video on your screen. If these survival tools impressed you, wait until you see what we have next.